Our final set of tasks for initial administration is we're going to look at promotion of content. We'll review the options for moving content in Viya. We'll look at moving content from Visual Analytics on 9.4. We'll look at reorganizing our content, and we'll also look at moving content between two Viya environments, so within Viya. Just a word on terminology. In this area, there's kind of three approaches you can take to move content between SAS releases. Promotion, that's the process of copying content between deployments. So exporting something from one deployment and moving it into another deployment. Migration, if you remember SAS 9.4, we had migration. That was the process of creating a new deployment from an existing deployment. So we used the SAS migration utility and the SAS deployment wizard to create a whole new deployment from an existing deployment, including the configuration and including the content. And then we also have upgrade in place, which updates an existing deployment and preserves the configuration and content in the deployment. So that's the three sort of main approaches that we have within SAS. So Viya doesn't support migration. There's no SAS migration utility, SAS deployment wizard in Viya. So you can forget about migration for now. Viya does support promotion from 9.4 to Viya. We'll get into detail on that. There are caveats involved in that, but it does support it. And Viya does support promotion between two Viya environments. So promotion of content from one Viya environment to another, and also supports upgrade in place. So if you want to get to 3.4, which is the release that just came out, that we're doing the class on, and you're currently on 3.3, you can do an upgrade of your 3.3 environment and upgrade it to 3.4. It's going to upgrade the software. It's going to keep any reports or data plans or anything else you've developed in the environment. So we do have upgrade in place. We'll focus mostly on promotion now. Promotion of existing content. If you're coming from 9.4, you have to be on one of the version 7 releases of VA, so 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, or 7.4. If you're promoting content in Viya, you can promote from any version 8 to the most recent release of VA 8.3. There are caveats though, because the promotion support has increased over time, so you can't promote everything from an 8.1 environment to an 8.3 environment. In terms of the interfaces we would use for promotion, they're different based on our source system. In 9.4, you're probably all familiar with the export and import wizard in Management Console. We also had batch tools in 9.4 that did the same thing. So if you're coming from 9.4, you can use the batch tools, you can use the export wizard. From Viya 3.2 to import-export, we used the SAS transfer command line interface. This was before we had the SAS admin command line interface. When we got to 3.3, we got the SAS admin command line interface, and transfer became a plugin to that interface. So what you do from 3.2 is different from what you do from 3.3 and 3.4, but it's only slightly different. The syntax is almost exactly the same, except transfer became a plugin of SAS admin, so you have to put SAS admin in front of it instead of SAS transfer. We also have in 3.3 and 3.4 import and export interfaces in SAS Environment Manager. So there's a button that you can click and you can export, and a button that you can click and you can import. In 3.3, you could only import and export other Viya packages, but in 3.4, it adds support for 9.4 packages and mapping files in EV. So we can import using Environment Manager 9.4 content, which we couldn't do in 3.3. Now we can do that in 3.4. And Viya has this concept of a mapping file in promotion. We had something similar if you used the batch tools in 9.4. The mapping file really is a file that maps the information from the source environment to where you want it to go in the target environment. So you have connectors in there which map source resources to target resources. On the screen, we have a connector here that's mapping a user to another user. And here's a table connector, which is mapping a laser table to where the target cast table will be. So that's what connectors do. They take one resource. They say this was the resource in the target environment. It's going to be this resource in the source environment. It's going to be this resource in the target environment. And then the other thing we have in the mapping files are substitutions. And what substitutions do is they substitute the value for an attribute differently in the target environment. So in this case, we have the directory path for financial data. We want to ignore whatever that was in the source environment and replace the path with this value, because that's the value for the target environment. So replace an attribute is a substitution, and map to resources is a connector. And mapping files are important because the way it works in Viya 3.4 is you can build out these mapping files. So the interface, you generate one initially, and then as you do more imports, you can append to that mapping file or add to that mapping file. The software will do it for you, and your mapping file will continue to build out. And at some point, most of the things you're going to see between two environments will be in the mapping file, and you won't need to change it. It will map everything from the source to the target, but you can continue to add things. So mapping files are useful and are cumulative in Viya. All right, we'll look at Viya to Viya promotion first. It's a little simpler than 9.4 to Viya promotion. As I mentioned before, the resources that are supported has increased over time. In 3.2, reports and folders were basically the only things that we could promote. In 3.3, we added data plans. And now in 3.4, we have support for all these different resources within Viya. By support, we mean that in 3.4, I can export those resources and import them to a target environment. So basically what you can do is determined by what you can get out. Currently we can get these out of 3.4, and then the other things we can get out of 3.3. Okay? So a lot more support. This is an area that's continuing to be developed by R&D. So I'm going to walk through an export and import via the CLI for a Viya to Viya promotion. You can do this just as easily, if not more easily, via the interface by pointing and clicking. But I'm showing you it via the CLI here because we're going to use the interface extensively when we do the 9.4 promotion. So I'm going to show you Viya to Viya via the CLI, and then 9.4 to Viya using the interface mostly. The transfer interface, when you go to export, is expecting a URI. So that's remember I mentioned URIs yesterday, about how resources are identified in Viya. They're all via a unique URI. With the transfer interface, if you want to export something, it expects a URI, not the actual path to something. So if we want to export a folder, the first thing we want to do is get the URI for the folder. Fortunately, we can do that from another SAS admin CLI plugin, the folders plugin. We do show and pass it the path to the folder in the folder tree. It will generate for us the URI, the ID and the URI of the folder. And then we can take that and we can pass it to transfer. So within transfer, I can do SAS admin transfer, use the export command, pass it the URI that I got from the previous step, and it will create a package of that content in Viya. That package is created within the Viya software. So it's stored within Viya in the infrastructure data server. If I want to use that package, my next step is to take that package and I want to download it. In the previous step here, when I did the export, it gave me the ID of the package, right? So that's the ID of the package within Viya. On the next step, when I want to download it, the download is going to create a JSON file with the content. So packages are JSON in Viya. I do SAS admin, transfer, download. I pass it the ID from the previous step, and I give it a file name, and that's going to take my package and download it into a file in JSON format. And that's my packaged up content. I want to take that over to my target system. So now I've exported, I've created a package, I've downloaded the package into a JSON file. I copy the JSON file to my target environment, and then, not surprisingly, the first thing I need to do in the target environment is upload that package into Viya on the target environment. So there I do the transfer plugin, upload, give it the name of the file, and in this step I can optionally create a mapping file of the transfer package. So that's going to generate a mapping file that I can then edit. So upload to Viya and create a JSON mapping file.
Do we have to define the location of where to upload, or does it know?
Yeah, there's no location. So the question was, do you have to define the location of where you upload? It's basically uploading into the Viya environment. So it's getting stored in Viya, inside I think it's the package service. So the package service manages packages. It loads it into the package service. There's other transfer commands you can do to list the packages that are available and list their content and delete packages. But there's no sort of location. It just goes into the infrastructure data server in Viya. So again, I get the ID of my package that I've uploaded. This is an example of the mapping file. So in 3.3, the mapping files were YAML, which, if you're familiar with the deployment of the software, YAML files are used with Ansible to do the deployment. But the only place you saw a YAML file after the software was deployed was here in the transfer service. Almost everything else is JSON, so they decided to standardize it. It's now JSON format by default, although you can still generate a YAML file for backward compatibility. So with the mapping file I generated in the previous step, I can change things to map my source to my target. So in this case, the source and the target are the same, but say this file was on a different CAS server, because now we can have multiple CAS servers. You would say in the target environment, you would change the CAS server here, say it's CAS shared default 2 or something like that, or it could be in a different library or a different table. This is where you would make the connections between the source and the target in the mapping file before you do the import. And then go to the import, go to SAS admin, do a transfer import, pass it the ID from the previous step, the upload step. I got an ID, and then pass it the mapping file. That's going to import the JSON package to the environment. It's going to map the resources based on what you had in the mapping file, and you should see your reports and your folders and all that appear in the Viya environment. Make sense? It's easier via, I've showed you how to do it the hard way. In the Environment Manager interface, you can click in your source environment and do an export. It will create the JSON file and download it at the same time. It downloads it to your the desktop of where your browser's running. You can then copy that JSON file over to the target environment. You can click and do an import. It will bring up the import interface. It does the upload and import at the same time too, and import it to the target environment. So that's the easier way to do it. But just to show you the CLI, because we're going to do the Viya interface in the 9.4 section. Any questions? All right, let's look at promotion from SAS 9.4 to Viya. So for visual analytics, the following resources participate in promotion. In the configuration area, identities, authorization, and data definitions are the resources that participate in promotion. And then in terms of content, we have folders, reports, explorations, stored processes, has an asterisk beside it, and I'll explain what that asterisk is a little bit later. And then other supporting resources like themes, images, graphs, and templates, graph templates. That's what those are the resources that participate in promotion from 9.4 to Viya. And then in the next few sections, participate is a word that can be interpreted a variety of ways, right? I'll explain to you what participate means for each of those different resources. So identities first. So I said with identities, the users and groups participate in promotion. Basically, the reason we get identities participating in promotion is with the 9.4 to Viya promotion, we want to be able to try to re-implement authorization in the new Viya environment. And we've seen already that SAS authorization and general authorization are very different from SAS 9.4. So this is a first step in us being able to take content from 9.4 and move it to Viya and preserve the permission settings in the Viya environment. It's not completely there, but it is the first step in that process. And in order to do that, if we want to reapply the permissions in a target environment, we need to know the users and groups from the source environment. What users and groups do they map to in the target environment? So that's the whole reason why users and groups participate in promotion. Something that can be confusing is you might think, oh, I'm promoting my users and my groups from my source environment to my target environment. You're not actually moving any users from the source environment to the target environment, right? Users were in metadata in SAS 9.4. Where are users in Viya? They're in LDAP, right? You're not going to be putting anything into LDAP. The reason you're doing anything with users is so that you can map a user from the source environment to the existing user in the target environment. There's no users actually being moved. Groups is similar, but it is slightly different. We do have this concept of custom groups in Viya. You will see some custom groups getting promoted as part of the promotion process, and you'll also see some users being added to groups as part of the promotion process. So no users are actually moved, and no users are actually created. Groups, some custom groups may be created, and some group membership may be changed. So it's mostly a mapping process, with the one caveat that you can see custom groups getting created. So what happens with identities during promotion? So user connections are mapped from the default auth authentication domain in SAS 9.4. So only default auth authentication domain to using the logon ID of the user to the Viya identity ID. And you get a chance to, you'll see it in the hands-on, it's going to generate a mapping file for you, and you're going to have to edit the mapping file to make that work. Metadata-only groups are converted to SAS Viya custom groups with two exceptions. We had SAS general servers and SAS system services in SAS 9.4 that were sort of groups that we created specifically to make the software work, right? There is no such similar constructs in Viya, so they are completely ignored, general servers and SAS system services. Other groups are migrated over, so sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. You'll see that in the hands-on. And if a custom group of the same name exists in the target environment, the group's not moved over, but the group is preserved, and any members from the source environment that are in the target environment are added to that custom group in the target environment. So you'll also see that happen in the hands-on. You'll see some group membership increase for certain groups because they were in a group in the source environment, but they weren't in it in the target environment initially. For the predefined identities in SAS 9.4, this is directly from the documentation. This is how they participate in this process. The public group is mapped to everyone, so that only really applies if a guest access is set up, the everyone group, and that mapping is used to set authorizations. The SAS users group is mapped to authenticated users, and that's used to set authorization. We did have a SAS administrators group in SAS 9.4, right? SAS administrators group is mapped to SAS administrators in Viya, and that's used to set authorization for administrators. So your authorization could be updated, and also membership. If someone that's in the Viya environment and was in the SAS administrators group in 9.4 will be added to the SAS administrators group in Viya. And then Visual Data Builder Administrators Group, anyone who's a member of that will become a member of the Data Builders Group in Viya. And Visual Analytics Data Administrators Group, anyone who was in that in 9.4 will become a member of the Application Administrators Group in Viya. So we have the two authorization systems. Promotion is going to attempt for general authorization to convert the authorization from SAS 9.4 to rules in the general authorization system. The first thing to know is that access control templates are not promoted. So access control templates are ignored currently. R&D is working on that because they do realize that access control templates were a common way to implement authorization in SAS 9.4, and so they are working on adding support for access control templates. Any access control entries are converted to SAS Viya rules. Any access control entries with denials, they are discarded. So because prohibit is so powerful in Viya, they made a decision to throw away any access controls that would introduce a prohibit to the Viya system, because they foresaw the case where it could just make a real mess of your authorization in Viya if they took the prohibits over. So they're basically ignored. In terms of the objects, if an object does not exist in the target environment, right, when it's promoted over, in terms of its authorization, it gets the authorization that it would get if you just created that object in the target environment through SAS Environment Manager or through Visual Analytics. So it gets its sort of default authorization based on where you create it in the tree. And then the authorization that comes from 9.4 is also merged in on top of that. So you won't see just the 9.4 authorization in there. You will see the default authorization as if it was just created by a user and not as part of the import process. If it exists in the target environment, so the access controls are just merged. So whatever access controls are on it, currently, the 9.4 access controls are merged in to the rules that are currently there. In terms of CAS, a different authorization system, Promotion is going to try to convert SAS 9.4 authorizations to CAS access controls. Again, access control templates are not promoted, so it's coming from the same authorization system in 9.4 as general authorization, it's just they're split in Viya. Access control entries are not promoted unless they're applied directly to a library or a table. So if you had set up your 9.4 authorization to have your libraries and tables inheriting permissions from the folders, it's not going to be promoted. Access control entries are converted to CAS access controls. Any row level permissions you had set up in 9.4 metadata, row level permissions are preserved. So that's really nice. Different from Viya authorization, general authorization, if an object exists in the target environment for CAS, no authorization settings are imported. So it just ignores the authorization system for existing objects. Data definitions, physical data is not promoted, right? So your laser data, your base SAS data, you have to make that available to CAS, right? There's no physical movement of data. Lots of different ways to do that, right? But the data definitions, so the metadata about the data, that can be promoted. So label libraries and servers can be promoted to laser-based CAS libs. You can have a CAS lib that points at a laser server. I haven't mentioned that. So if you have a laser library and server in 9.4, you can promote that and it can become a laser-based CAS lib within Viya. So that you might use in a scenario where you're trying out Viya, but keeping your data in laser because you have an existing environment. Laser and base libraries can also be promoted to path-based CAS libs. So you can take a SAS library as part of the promotion process, you can create a CAS library that points to the same path as the SAS library. And laser and base tables can both be exported to support the mapping to the corresponding CAS tables. Stored processes are special, right? Promotion of reports that contain stored processes to Viya is supported. The way it works is the VA report is promoted to Viya, but the stored process is not. It remains in the 9.4 environment. And the reason we say it's supported is the Viya report accesses the stored process from the 9.4 environment. So the Viya environment has to be able to access the 9.4 environment for this to work, because we don't have a stored process server right now, really, in Viya. So the report will just go to the 9.4 environment and access the stored process from there. So the steps you would go through to do this, and we're going to do it in the hands-on in a second. First of all, in order for any of this to work, you have to have your identity management configured. So if we're mapping to users and groups, then we need to be all set up in Viya to be able to map to users and groups, right? I mentioned that the data is not promoted, so we have to make sure that the data that we had in the 9.4 environment is available to the CAS server. So we have to have CAS lives, or not really CAS lives, but we have to have the actual physical data accessible to the CAS environment. You would export your packages from 9.4. We're not going to do that in class. We don't have a 9.4 environment. At the start of the hands-on, if you want to see how it was done, there's a video that's actually in your target environment, in your Viya environment. You can click on the video and you can watch how the import of all the resources that you're going to, the export of all the resources that you're going to import happened. And then to import the packages, what you're going to do in the hands-on is, the first step, you need to use the CLI. That's how you generate your initial mapping file. And then you will import in a specific order. Just like in SAS 9.4, we need to be able to make the mappings. So we need to do it in a certain order. We need to make sure identities are there first, so that when we import libraries and servers, if we're using important authorization, it knows the identities. We need to import libraries and servers next, so that when we import data, it knows what library and what server to map it to. And then our last step is to import the reports and explorations, which need the other three things to be available to map to in the target environment. So I mentioned the export. You can watch the video to see how it was done. Some considerations for export, because export can determine how easy it is for you to do the import. This is from my experience of working with the tools. I don't think anyone's had a great deal of experience in working with them yet. The software's pretty new. But from my experience, the identities you export from the security folder in SAS 9.4. So you should right-click on that security folder and do the export. If there's any groups that you see in there, you only export users and groups, right? Not roles or anything else under that tab. But if there's any groups in there that you don't need in the target environment, then deselect them at this point, or you're going to get them created in your target environment. A good example of that is, we had a SAS environment manager in SAS 9.4, right, that had a bunch of groups that it used. SAS environment manager users group, SAS environment manager administrators group. Those things don't mean anything to Viya, right? If you don't deselect them in this step, they're going to be created as custom groups in your Viya environment, and you'll just have to clean them up on the other side. So take a look at the users and groups and select the ones that you want to see in the target environment. Laser and base libraries. So libraries that are going to become CAS libs, do the export directly from the library and not from the folders that the libraries are in. Libraries and tables in SAS 9.4 existed in the folder structure, right? In Viya, they are in CAS libs, so they're not within the Viya content area. If you do the export somewhere up the tree, and you go to import on the Viya side, you'll get the folder structure that your libraries were in, created in your Viya environment, even though there'll be nothing that ends up in it because your CAS lib is going to be created. CAS libs don't occur inside folders. So if you do the export directly from the library, then you won't get all the folders that come with the library. It will just create the CAS lib inside the data area on the server. Do the libraries and tables in separate packages. That allows you to do the mapping easier when you do the import, I found. So if you create the libraries first as an import step, and then your next import step imports the tables, the library, the CAS lib is there. It's available for mapping for the tables to say they're in this CAS lib. And for content, for reports and folders, it's best to do them from the base of the folder tree, because if you miss a folder that has an access control, so if you do it from further down the folder tree, you might miss a folder maybe 3 levels up that has an access control applied to it, and that access control will not be promoted to the target environment. So the opposite of libraries and tables, do your folders from the base of the folder tree, do your libraries and your tables from the actual objects. Just makes it easier when you do the import. So content that won't be promoted, I mentioned data. We've looked at user-defined formats, right? The user-defined formats are not part of this process, but we've already shown you how to import them to the target environment from the SAS catalog. VDB jobs are not supported. Comments are not supported. Any custom themes you had in VA, they're not supported completely, but it does create a dummy theme in 8.2 that you can then edit. So it tries to get you close to what you want, but they're not fully supported. So some assumptions for authorization. If you are promoting for promotion, if you are promoting authorization, we assume that LDAP is set up and the user identities that participate in the authorization already exist in the LDAP environment. Data tables for the imported reports exist or are accessible to CAS. Any required custom formats already exist in the CAS environment. Any objects like report links or images are included in the same transfer package. And if you're doing stored processes, you need to make sure the stored process server is accessible to the Viya environment. Currently in 3.4, you have to be an administrator to export and import content in Viya. So no non-administrator users can do that. It's an administration-only piece of functionality. The content from VA 7.1 will need to be secured with Viya rules if you choose not to include authorization. If authorization is not included in the export. And I should have mentioned that you can do that. There is a setting in the mapping file that you can set to say don't take authorization, which it may be something you want to do. Given that the two authorization systems are so different, you may want to just re-implement your authorization. So you can do that. If you do choose to include authorization, you're going to have to thoroughly test it, right? I told you that access control templates are not included and some other stuff. So you're actually really going to get a partial promotion of authorization. You're not going to get everything. For that reason, you're really going to want to have to test the security model when you get to Viya. Because it imported doesn't mean it works. So if you import a report, it says, I successfully imported your report. There's no guarantee that if you go to your report, it's going to work. You do need to test it. Test the reports. There's a lot of complicated things you could do in VA. I'm pretty sure we haven't hit every test case that possibly exists in our customer base, so do test them. There's no selective import right now. You can't subset a package. So you have a package, you do an import, everything in the package is going to be imported. There's no excluding something at the time that you import it. When you do the import, you can't specify a new location for imported objects. You can't do any remapping of the location of objects during an import. So if I export a report that is in folder A, then folder B, then folder C, when I do the import, it's going to create folder A, folder B, folder C, and the report. And then you might have to clean up or move stuff around based on if that's what you wanted in your target environment. And then for a Viya to Viya export and import, it merges the authorization rules from the source environment into the target environment. So that it preserves authorization for a Viya to Viya promotion, just like it tries to do for SAS 9.4. One other thing before we got into the hands-on is I did mention that you could export and import CAS authorization. Some of the other CLIs also support this type of functionality. So the thing we did on the first day, when we set up our identity our identity configuration to see what's coming back from LDAP, you can use the configuration CLI to export that type of information and be able to then take it and import that to a different environment. And that applies to configuration, and some other of the CLIs also support export and import. So another use of this is you might have set up your environment to have the logging just like you like it. You could export that logging to save it. And then if another time you need to ramp up logging on 2 or 3 services, you could do that. And then you could re-import your logging configuration to set your logging back to the way it was initially. So that's quite cool. All right, so the hands-on, we're going to do 5.1 and 5.2. Import the HR reports from Viya. So we're going to do a Viya to Viya import. And then we're going to do a hands-on that imports finance content from 7.4. So we're going to add the finance group back to the environment and import some of their contact into the environment.